In this video, I want to talk to you about factoring. Factoring is probably the one most important thing that we do in Algebra 2. In fact, if you want to be successful in Algebra 2, you have to know what factoring is. There should be strobe lights around that, flashing lights, sequence, whatever, because factoring is extremely important. So before we even start factoring using anything with algebra, I just want to talk about vocabulary. So if I were to have a number, let's just say the number 10, and I were to say factor that, you actually have to give me two numbers or more that multiply together to give me that. So my factors of 10 is very simple. It's just 2 times 5. So factoring is in fact undoing multiplication, because if I were to do 2 times 5, I get 10. So when I factor, I'm trying to figure out the two numbers that multiply together give me 10. So the thing to remember about factoring is that factoring is the opposite of multiplication. Okay? I'm trying to figure out what numbers are getting multiplied together to give me that. So let's do another example. So if I had the number 30, and I were to say, factor that, you could say 3, and I would tell you, no, that's a factor. So 3 simply is a factor, but if I want to know the factors, I would have to say 3 times 10. So that's the difference. Each one of these, so 2 is a factor of 10, right? And then I could say 5 is a factor of 10. So here I'm using the word factor as a noun. Oh my, I'm now talking about English. So this here is a noun. But when I'm using it here, I'm now using it as a verb. Okay? So you have to do something. Okay? Verbs have action. Okay. So this is, I could say, a factor. There's many more. But we really want to do what's called a prime factorization. So 3 is already prime, and 10, as we see, is also 2 times 5. So here I have 3 factors. When multiplied together, give me 30. This here is called prime factorization. Okay, so as I said, I have 3 factors. When multiplied together, give me 30. The factors of 30 are 3 times 10, or I could say the prime factors are 3 times 2 times 5. That's very, very, very important. Okay, so then that's just factoring. I'm asking for the factors of a number. But if I ask you for this, the greatest common factor, okay, it also could be called the greatest common, this in your calculator would be called this the divisor, okay, thing that you divide by. Greatest common factor, remember when we're looking for things in common, that means we're making a comparison. So when we're making a comparison, we're looking at a comparison between 2 or more numbers. Okay? So this is where it gets confusing, because notice we have the word factor here and we have the word factor here. These are going to be two different things. The factor of a number is two numbers multiplied together, sometimes three numbers multiplied together, to give me the original number. I'm breaking it down. But when I'm looking for the greatest common factor, I'm doing something else. So let's look at these two numbers. I have the number 45 and I have the number 30. So I want to know what is the greatest common factor. So that's the question. What is the greatest common factor between the two? Okay. So remember, factor is breaking things down into two things that multiply together. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a factoring tree. And I'm going to start with 1. And I know 45 divided by 1 gives me 45. I cannot divide 45 by 2. I'm actually now going to go on to 3. So 45 divided by 3 gives me 15. 4 doesn't go in, but 5 does. 45, notice I'm using this like a division. 45 divided by 5 gives me 9. So now I've written my factors. Notice I didn't do prime factors, just my factors of 45. Now I have to do my factors of 30 because I'm looking at what 45 and 30 have in common. So I'm going to go through the same thing. 1 times 30, 2 times 15, 3 times 10, and 5 times 6, and then it repeats with 6 times 5. Okay, so let's look at all the numbers that they have in common. What do they have in common? Well, they have 1 in common. They have 3 in common. They have 5 in common. But they also have 15 in common. So the largest number they have in common is 15. So the largest factor that 45 and 30 have in common is 15. Okay, so notice when I'm asking for common, it has to be two things. And if I'm asking just for factoring, I'm just looking at one thing. So you have to distinguish, am I just factoring or am I looking for a common factor? Okay, so one last thing that I want to do. So let's say I have 45x plus 30. And I want you to factor this. Well, the first thing I'm going to do, is I'm going to say, what's the greatest common factor? So I went and I did my factoring tree, just regular factors, and I found out they have 15 in common. So the greatest common factor is 15. So what am I going to do with that information? I'm going to divide 15 outside of the parentheses. Notice it went out. Now I'm going to divide. Well, 45 divided by 15. 45 divided by 15 gives me 3. That x is still there. This is positive, so this is positive. 30 divided by 15. 30 divided by 15 gives me 2. Okay. I have just factored that binomial by taking out the greatest common factor. So as we're factoring, we're going to be doing a lot more than this. I'm just giving you a heads up. On vocabulary, you really need to know the difference between just simply when I just say factor, I want the factors, and when I say I want the greatest common factors. They both have the word factor in it, but they're not the same thing.